All right, everybody. Good morning, good morning, good morning. Hey, hey, hey. Glad you made it, Danny. All righty. All right, let's see here. Let's make sure everything's up and running on the YouTube side so I can pull the chat out. Okay. Looks like the slides are working. Cool deal. Let me just pop out the YouTube back in real quick here, and we should be rocking and rolling. There we go. All right, awesome. Now I can see everything. Cool deal. All right. All right. So, some really interesting stuff today, folks. We got the Grail myth in its entirety. Oh, my browser lost connection to my camera. What the hell? Let's see here. That makes no sense. Hello, hey Rand, or hey Ryan, how you doing, brother? Let's see here. Settings, camera. Yeah, that camera. Well, whatever, y'all can hear me, right? If my camera wants to be a douchebag, my camera can be a douchebag. You don't necessarily need to see my ugly mug to get everything going here. So I will troubleshoot the camera in a minute, but let's kind of get to it here. All right. So basically, we're talking today about the Grail quest, the Grail myth. And there's going to be several things that we go over today as far as the context to understand the entirety of Arthurian myth of fertility ritual upon which it's based, right? And this kind of comes back, and you'll see a lot of things in, for example, like Fraser's Golden Bough. A lot of sleep token stuff utilizes a lot of this kind of the ritual mythology of the fertility ritual of the dying god, of the sacrificing of a god, and then the resurrection of the god, the rebirth of the fertility god. If we remember, definitely the music video for the offering. We remember even the video for the way you were. There's a lot of different kind of ritual sacrifice, fertility symbolism, and a lot of sleep tokens, not only lyrics, but also in their music videos as well, whenever they go about codifying their songs into video. So the first thing, actually, I'm going to, hang on, just give me 1 second, folks. I want to freaking troubleshoot this camera thing. It's kind of bugging me. Just 1 second, folks. All right, we're back now, folks. I don't know what the hell was up with that. All right, rock and roll. You can see my ugly mug again now. All right, cool. All right, so the first thing we're going to look at here is the origin of the ancient Arthurian myth. So first of all, what do we mean by the authorial myth? What do we mean by the Grail myth? Let me actually go back to that before I go with the precursor. All right. We mean specifically those bits of Arthurian romance, the stories that were written, whether in prose or poetry form, about King Arthur's court and about the knights that were involved with Arthur's hierarchy, with the Lady of the Lake, the myth of the Grail, the myth of like this, Merlin and Guinevere and Galahad, and all those tales are generally referred to as Arthurian romance or Arthurian myth. Okay? So when we're talking about the Grail quest, it's a very small subset of that. You have lots of stories about like the jousting tournaments and courtly intrigue and courtly love and Lancelot cheating on, or Lancelot and Guinevere cheating on Arthur during their reign, and then Arthur having to joust Lancelot, and Lancelot beating Arthur. And that kind of like really interesting, like Game of Thrones courtly intrigue stuff, that really like political / like soap drama, Days of Our Lives. Oh, who's Guinevere banging this week kind of thing. That's a lot that's concerned in the general Arthurian romance category. But the Grail myth is very much a smaller subset of that. In fact, as we look to the literary record as well as the historical record, the Grail is really kind of a very important, very shortly lived element in Arthurian legend. The first time a Grail is mentioned in any kind of Arthurian text that we have saved, that's like preserved to us, that we still have access to, the first time it's mentioned is in Chetin de Troyes' Parzival. And that's written around, I'll have a timeline up in a second here, that's written around 1150, in the 1100s AD. And that's the first time the Grail appears. Now, within the next, say, 60 to 70 years, you have the first mention of the Grail in any kind of Arthurian romance or myth, and then you have this explosion of Grail text. You have not only Le Morte d'Arthur by Mowry in England, you have Parzival in German, you have Welsh versions, you have Scottish versions, and everything has to do with a specific Grail quest. The questing knight is out to do a searching quest to find the Grail, to increase his knowledge, to increase his wisdom, to save the land, etc. But then around the year 1300, maybe a little bit after that, the Arthurian romance and myth morphs again. The Grail, the quest, the chapel, all that stuff, the castle, the wasteland, the Fisher King, symbols we'll get into in just a second, right? All these essential elements that are in every different version of every different Grail myth, from the time the Grail myth began and exploded to that 50, 60-year period, all of a sudden they just disappear entirely. We have more Arthurian legend, more courtly drama, more Arthurian romance than ever before. Things were exploding. Very popular thing to perform as a bard or to sell as a poet or a scribe. However, even though there's more Arthurian stuff being produced than ever before, there's no further reference to these sacred symbols and these Grail elements that kind of go back to an ancient fertility cult. All right. And so what we really want to get at, if we look at the Arthurian myth, we can kind of put it into three buckets, okay? We have what are historical tales, like the actual historical Arthur. And there's fairly good evidence to show right now that there was, the guy that we call King Arthur actually was a British lord. He lived around 520 to 620 AD, around in there. And we have a lot of different historical accounts that whether he was Arthur or that's an anglicized version of a Roman name is really unimportant. There was a king who led the Britons to union and to fight the Saxons who were coming over and invading them, the Normans too at that point. And he lost a big battle and ended up dying, according to the historical records, around 550 AD. And that kind of throws the entirety of Britain, the entirety of the island, into this chaos. And then you see the first, and everybody's in upheaval, they've been invaded, Arthur lost, he's dead now. There's a mythologizing and a cultural folklore level that takes over there. It's like a cultural myth. It's like Romulus and Remus, or Hercules, or in America, George Washington chopping down the cherry tree, or Johnny Appleseed, or Pecos Bill, or something like that, like a cultural icon. And so there's these cultural stories that begin taking off. about Arthur slaying dragons, and Arthur and the round table comes up around here, and Arthur and his chastity, the sword and the stone, the lady in the lake. All these really like kind of cultural, folksy myths, right? But not the Grail myth, not the Grail quest. So all that stuff springs up about then, and then you have the transformation of these really folk, Celtic, like tall tales into this really symbolized, ritualized, mythical enactment that comes around at the beginning of the 10th century or the 11th century, so the 1000s AD. And that's what we get our Grail romances, our actual Grail quest narratives to begin. So the thing that I want to look at as well is there's the third element, that goes into the Grail quest and the Grail myth. That's all the later on ones, all the ones written after 1250 AD or 1300 AD. They, at that point in time, get rid of this fertility ritual stuff, which we'll go into again soon. The Grail disappears from the text as a ritual artifact. It can still show up as the chalice in the communion service for Catholicism. In fact, that's what happens to the Grail stories and narratives, is after about 1250 to 1300 AD, Christianity has so expanded and entrenched itself into southern Britain and the entirety of the continent of Europe that they ban a lot of the Grail ritual stuff, a lot of the Grail narrative that was originally put out there, the fertility myth stuff, and supplant it with extremely Christian narratives. So there's no quest anymore. It's just the knight is tempted by some bodily clad woman who wants to test his purity, and he decides not to sleep with her. And so he upholds his virtue of charity, and y'all be good and make sure you tithe the monk at the monastery this weekend. Okay. It's become almost entirely captured by Christian dogma in the 1300s. And so if we're looking for the actual origin of the myth, the actual ritual that the Grail was associated with, it's not completely divorced from Christianity and Christian ritual, but it has something deeper, something that's a longer, older undertone of cultural practices, of myths, of symbols, which is what I really want to get into today and kind of tell how to separate the different Arthurian myths, the different questers, Galahad, Lancelot, Parsifal, Gawain, Bors, Tristan, how their stories are very unique to the specific quester, how they harken back to an earlier time, an earlier mythology, an earlier ritual that was in fact pre-Christian, and watch how that kind of develops and the ritual and the performance of these fertility rites carry on. So I want to go way back, way before Arthur, the historical Arthur in 500, way before Jesus in 0, way back. I want to go to ancient fertility cults, especially Attis, Tammuz, Adonis, and Mithras. Now, I'll go over each of these in turn, not spend a ton of time on each of them. But the point is that these are ancient Mesopotamian. I'll see if I can zoom in on that dang thing. Oh, wow. Well, that right there it's a rendering of an early chalice. It's what later became, it's a artist depiction of the vessel in which you carry the consecrated host, the wafer, at the communion in Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodox Catholicism, Coptic Catholicism too. It's the sacred container that you carry the sacrifice, the transubstantiated body of Christ in for the sacrifice of the Mass. But it has a lot of and this is a rendering that was done, by a artist in, I believe, about 1050. And we see the kind of childish look it has here too, right? And this is actually imported from the Near East, which is where these cults, these gods that I'm talking about here, come from. And we'll see why this kind of symbolism, this very interesting Grail with a spoke above it, becomes relevant to the Grail myth in general. Okay. So let's go to Attis and Tammuz first. So the whole idea is that the argument is largely that the Grail myth as it was first practiced, the Grail ritual, the fertility ritual, the Grail quest in these narratives, these myths become, is largely transported over and combined from different sorts of fertility and god worship from the Near East and actually the Far East. So Attis and Tammuz are two gods, or probably actually the same god with different names depending on the the country you're in and at what point in time it is. So Attis and Tammuz are from originally ancient Babylon, Syria, Phoenicia, and Phrygia. So again, if we're talking, I remember Owen and I talked last time about the Phrygian mode and in Phrygia as this very kind of outside of the norm, but still very Greek colony during the mythological age, that the Phrygian folks were into the fertility cults and the mystery ritual and had a separate set of kind of like Bacchanalian, Dionysian, like orgiastic fertility gods they go off and worship. So it's very interesting that the area of the world we're talking about, and if you want to talk too about the same area, the Etruscan rituals and the Etruscan fertility cults, which is where Vessel gets the characters, the runes for all the masks on. They're all Etruscan ritualistic derivative runes from around this time. And so there's a lot of this kind of ritualistic symbolism and metaphor and symbol brought in already. So, and anyway, back in Babylon, Assyria, and Phoenicia, it was custom, and actually it continued in parts of the world, in parts of these parts of the world. The same ritual happened and was continued to go on yearly on the feast of the fertility feasts up until after World War I, kind of when globalism started. A lot of the individual ritual, culture, mythic stuff got taken away from the world. And it's only really been the last 100 years that people haven't actually been actively performing these kind of fertility rituals and rites, if not as an actual belief in paganism, then as a cultural celebration, like the Day of the Dead, or like May Day, or Holly Day, or Halloween, right? And so these things seem like they might be very off in our distant past, but they're not. They were going on until very recently. So the specific ritual that is common to all of these areas of the world at this ancient point in time, right, is you would carry a figure, which is the vegetation spirit, the vegetation god. Attis was the most prominent name for that, on a bier. It's like a funeral, like the thing that you carry a dead body to the grave in, a bier, or bier, I guess you could say, a bier. The god, or a figure representing the god, a person, somebody who's going to be the sacrifice, is put on a bier, carried by the citizens, a trail and procession of mourning women weeping loudly, crying loudly, follow them from town to town. And at that point in time, back in the day, like the old days, like, BC, like 2000 BC, 1500 BC, they would take the chosen sacrificial guy who's standing in for the vegetation spirit, the fertility god, the ritual god, and they would either bury them, or they would take them to the shoreline and throw them in the water after they tied them up so they couldn't swim, and then wait 3 days to make sure the body didn't wash back up on the shore. If it didn't, ritual offering accepted, you're good to go. So they either bury the figure, they throw it in the water as a drowned god, or sometimes, and it developed to be more like this, after a mock death, meaning it would be a fake, he would pretend to be dead, there'd be a symbolic killing, somebody like swing at his head with a sword, oh, I'm dead, they carry his dead body around, they bury him, then they dig him up before he actually suffocates down there, right? And that vegetation spirit, that fertility god, then comes up from the ground, signifying revivification, rebirth, and the fertility of the land, and then everybody rejoiced and everybody all happy about that. So there's another version of this in the Attis version where instead of burying the god whole, you would sacrifice the vegetation spirit, the effigy, the person who's a sacrificial vessel, and then you would cut them up into little pieces, and then you would plant the little, however big of a chunk you got of them, in each of the major fields of the city to help the crops grow. And this is very important. It's why fertility is such a prominent influence in these myths, is because if you're living in a world where your entire existence is based upon the cycles of the sun, is based upon the seasons, is based upon adequate rainfall, adequate temperature, you would kind of get these notions of how the gods and the life cycle work. Spring, the plants start growing again. You almost can have crops again. So it's a rebirth. Winter. So let's start in winter then. Winter. All the crops are dead. It's cold. It's uninhabitable. There's food shortages. There's famine. There's nothing going on in the living world outside of your little town or community, right? If there's a God who's controlling everything, it seems like that God has died. all your crops, all the animals, all the wildlife, all your food sources, even the water might be frozen. You have no means to sustain yourself. And so the life is draining from the land during this death god period. And the only hope is that if you give proper sacrifice, if you properly perform the ritual in the spring, when the vegetation god, when the buried god, the drowned god is sacrificed, at that point in time, that blood, that sacrifice goes into the land and allows the land to again bring crops alive. So if you think about it, winter's the dead god. Spring is the resurrection of the god. Summer is the life of the god. Fall, autumn is the old age of that god going back to his death. But every year the ritual and sacrifice has to be performed. Every year you have to get that essential blood of the god of Attis or Tammuz or Adonis or Mithra into the ground or to bless the ground, because otherwise those crops you rely on, the fish you rely on from the sea, the animals you rely on to hunt, the cows you tend, might not do so well next year. So this was not just kind of a one-off maypole, let's get drunk, feast of fools, and fool around kind of thing. This was very linked to the very survival of all the people in this Near East and Asian continent of Asia way of life and survival of their civilizations. All right. So the next key mythical fertility god is Adonis. Now, Attis, Adonis, Tammuz, and Mithra are really more or less the same god. Adonis is important to bring up here only because Adonis is all the rage in Greece. So Attis, Tammuz, Mithra kind of go back a little bit before. Adonis is there in the Phoenician colonies, so in like the seafaring peoples on the culture of on the coast of the Mediterranean. Adonis is already there, but Adonis hasn't gotten popular yet. Adonis hasn't blown up. Adonis hasn't hit it big yet. And so that doesn't happen until the Hellenistic times when the Greeks are in charge. Adonis kind of takes the stage, but incorporates all these other myths. It's the same exact thing. It's the fertility god, the sacrifice god, the drowned god, or the buried god. Adonis becomes both the drowned god and the buried god, the fertility god for the Greek folks in Phoenicia and Phrygia, and going down to Babylon and Egypt as well. All right, so to Adonis specifically, the reason why we need to look at Adonis specifically and differentiate Adonis from Attis and Tammuz and Mithra is because it's the Adonis version of these other myths that incorporates them that goes over and becomes the very seed of the Grail myth and the Grail religion and the fertility cult underlying it. So this is kind of like the updated 2.0 version of Mithra and Attis and even Osiris to some extent that actually makes it big into continental Europe and actually spreads far east as well. So Sir James Frazer, who's a boss, he did this study of comparative mythology called The Golden Bough. I mentioned it before, 26 volumes, like 500,000 pages, just documenting all the different cultural myths and nuance all across the world. Every tribe you could find, every different culture, just documenting the way that they did their society and their myths. Oh, it's an amazing read if you have 3 years of your life to devote reading to it. Okay. Anyway, so Frazer pointed out these are parallel and overlapping codes. Attis, Adonis, Osiris, Tammuz, Mithra. The name of the god and minute details of the ritual may differ by country, but whether the god is from Babylon, Phrygia, or Phoenicia, whether he be called Tammuz, Attis, Adonis, the main line of the story is fixed and invariable. Always, he is a young and beautiful. Always, the beloved of a great goddess. Always, he is the victim of a tragic and untimely death, a death which entails bitter loss and misfortune upon a mourning world, and which, for the salvation of the world, is followed by a resurrection. What other god that comes along, obviously not 3000 BC, but maybe around 0 BC, does this actually kind of ring a bell with? Young, beloved by a goddess, tragic death, it's unjust, everybody's whining and weeping, loss of misfortune in the world, and he gets resurrected to save the world. I don't know. Maybe people can put it in the chat if they have a guess of what that is. All right. So death and resurrection, mourning, rejoicing, present themselves in these two opposed things like winter and summer, right? Or winter and spring, winter, summer, death, rebirth, death, resurrection, mourning in the winter, rejoicing in the spring. All right. We know the god best is Adonis, for under that name that though not originally Greek, he became known as Greek to the Greek world, was carried by them to Alexandria in Egypt, and his feast assumed a major part of Egyptian state solemnity. Like it was a state holiday on Adonis's feast day in the spring every year in Egypt. So the Adonis ritual provided the classic form of this cult, which has been enshrined in art and is loved and lamented to this day. So again, these other kind of pre-Adonis myths, Attis, Osiris, Tammuz, Mithra, all get kind of subsumed into Adonis because it was all the same sort of ritual anyway. So as the Greeks spread their culture over to Europe and over to the Middle East and the Near East, the cult kind of becomes this fertility Adonis cult, and like the Elysian mysteries and stuff are a subset of an Adonis cult. All right. So now, you thought we were going to the Grail myth and the Knights in the Cup. No, we're actually going to go one step further back in time before we go forward. Because I think it's pretty much... So let me take this out. So we're looking right now with Attis, Adonis, Osiris, Tammuz. We're looking at about that 2000 maybe BC to 0 kind of time frame, these pre-Christian societies. So we're looking pretty early on to find Attis and the fertility ritual we talked about. Now, the question is, does that have another origin? Does the Attis myth, does the Adonis myth, does Tammuz myth have a precursor that goes even older than 1,500 years before the birth of Christ? Well, it does. And that goes back to the Indian text, the Rig Veda. And I think, too, when we think about the video for Calcutta, for example, and some of the symbolism and some of the allusions we're going to be getting as we get later into Sleep Token's work with the album Atlantic, as well as Taking Back to Eden, there becomes a higher rise of this kind of Vedic, Mahayana, and this Eastern Hindic kind of symbolism as well. I mean, Calcutta is obviously a great example of that, not only with the video that's produced, but also just the lyrics and the sounds to it. But anyway, so we're going to go back to the earliest recorded text we have, as far as the earliest dated text we have that has any kind of a mythos or any kind of a sacred text, a mythic text, a ritualistic text, is the Rig Veda. Written down over 5,000 years ago from today, so about 3,000 BC, give or take, is when the Rig Veda was written. And guess what? It has over 1,500 hymns to different gods, hymns to different goddesses, singing their praises and giving them proper ritual and sacrifice, okay? So the Rig Veda, over 5,000 years ago, describes the origin of spring fertility rituals and the myths they enact. So this is the first time we have anything written down ever in the entirety of humanity. Well, that's been preserved to this day. We might have had other shit millions of years ago. Who knows? But as far as the first written text that we have that survived, this is as old as we go. So the tradition relates... Okay, so this is one of the first hymns of praise to a god who's doing something that's quest-like, that's myth-like, that's fertility-like. And the god was Indra. Okay, so India had 7 great rivers, and they'd all been imprisoned by the giant Vitra or Ahi, depending on which translation you use, or which version you take of the story. And Indra slew that giant, thereby releasing the streams from their captivity. The Rig Veda hymns abound in reference to this feat. That's his hymn 951, I think. Thou hast set loose the 7 rivers to flow, Indra. Thou causest, this is a different hymn in praise. Thou causest waters to flow on every side. Indra set free the waters. Indra's myth is almost identical to the earliest Grail source text. The Rig Veda describes the freeing of the waters, the healing of a wounded king, breaking the curse on the wasteland. The land is wasted and dry and desolate because there are no waters. You free the waters. You can revivify the land that's gone waste, the wasteland. Overcoming temptations to be disloyal to the higher power and to your sovereign on earth. And also the slaying of monsters. In this case, Vitra or Ahi, the giants who had imprisoned the waters of India and the 7 rivers and had thus caused a drought and the desiccation of the land in India. All right. So we're going back to there. Now, a little bit more connection between... So I'm going to show how there are direct overlaps between the Vedic and the actual Grail myths, okay? And the things we were just talking about, these very symbolic things, the freeing of the waters, the wasteland, the healing of the land, the king being wounded, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it began, I mean, who knows when it began? We have record of it beginning in India about 5,000 years ago, 3000 BC. We have record of these kind of fertility cults then transferring the figure of Indra down to Attis, Adonis, Osiris, Tammuz, Mithra in the Near East, like Kazakhstan, all the stands, down to Turkey, and then into the Mediterranean. And when that happens, you have fractures off from the Indra version into Attis, Adonis, Osiris. But they all have this central mythical core that coagulates and comes back together in the first versions of the Grail myth in England, which I'll get to next. So just another thing that's almost you could have copy-pasted more or less section 8 of the Rig Veda, the story about the Brahmin and the foreign king whose land has been devastated by a drought. You can almost cut and paste this into the Gowan Grail myth, which we will discuss as the first Grail myth we go over. But the point being is that this is on par the same narrative as the Gowan myth, which we've written 4,000 years later across the world in early Middle English and Old French, kind of weird combination is how that Gowan tale was written. And here you have something written in Sanskrit or Hindi rather, 4,200 years before the Grail myth, but the story is almost identical. All right. So in the section we find a young Brahmin, Rishnakrinja, in a lonely forest hermitage. A drought falls on a neighboring kingdom. That land is wasted, and the inhabitants are reduced to great straits. They're all sick. They're dying of starvation. They have no food. The king of that other land wants to know why his people suffer and how they may be relieved. He learns from a sage that the reason, apparently, which is kind of weird, but whatever, the reason that his land has become desolate and his people are dying and there's no crops is apparently this guy in the other kingdom, Rishnakrinja, is a virgin. And so as long as he's a virgin, the drought will continue in this king's land. Sounds kind of shucky, but okay. So the king sends his daughter on a lavish ship down the river to a point not far from where the young Brahmin lives. The daughter persuades Rishnakrinja to accompany her, and they take her back to the king's land that's wasted. The king gives his daughter to Rishnakrinja as his wife. They marry. They go off and do the after marriage thing. The wink, wink, nod, nod, nudge, nudge. And as soon as that's consummated and done, the waters are freed. The land is restored. So again, there's something about fertility, about consummation, about bringing new life into the world and revivifying the land that is actually devastated, crops failing, people dying, animals diseased, etc. All right. So now we'll get to the action. So now we're going to so we were in ancient India. After we went to the Middle East in the 1,500 years BC, now, boom, we're back to the actual starting point, the actual beginning of the Grail text that we have. So the first Grail text we have that survived in written form is from about 1180 AD, 1180, 1182. The first surviving one is Parzival Le Conte de Grail, written by Chatelain de Troyes in 1882. Now, there are 4 spin-offs of Parzival that come in France between 1190 and 1230. So basically, de Troyes is the OG and writes Parzival, and then it becomes such a popular tale in France that you have fanfic writers popping up and writing other versions of it. And they're mostly under anonymous names, which is because they were kind of ripping off Parzival by de Troyes with only minor changes. So analysis of all the texts, both Chatelain de Troyes and all the other French sources that kind of copied or spun off of de Troyes, show that all of them, de Troyes and others, all borrowed from an earlier existing text. So when basically de Troyes in writing Parzival, the Conte de Grail, was really almost writing a fanfic himself. He had an access to an earlier text or seen a bard performing a version of the Grail myth and wrote it down or copied and added his own thing from a different into French, and that's the first text we have that survives. But there shows there are other texts that were written down before this that Dutoit and other French sources had access to. And also, well, the reason we'll get into this and it's important is because in the original text we have evidence to show, and I'll show it to you, that the first questing knight in the European Grail myth Arthurian text was Sir Gawain. Parzival, who was a knight in the court, was kind of added in a very fanfic kind of way during the French rewriting, the French injection of the Grail quest into its language in 1882 and the years leading up to that. All right, so here, I hope that's easy to see. So first of all, this is a image of the Holy Grail that's in the church at Rennes-le-Château. It's kind of pretty. So the Grail heroes, in order of their appearance, the first version is Gawain. Around 1175 AD, we have sources that even give us the author of it. There's some dispute about that. But unfortunately, all copies of it have been lost. There's no surviving copy of the first Gawain version. It was likely written in Wales or the British Isles. And then the spin-offs kind of begin coming up after that, 1282, 1250. Now, Parzival has some and this is Dutoit's Le Comte de Grail in 1882. So within 15 years of the initial publication of a Grail myth, Dutoit has it in France. Now, and he creates the hero Parzival. It's been Gawain up until then. And he adds a couple interesting wrinkles to it that's not present in the Gawain narrative. For example, there's no Grail per se. There's a silver platter, which is supposed to be the equivalence of the Grail. And if you think about it through Christian symbolism, which is how things were coded, and we'll get into this in a second, is what's the Grail? The chalice, the sacrificial chalice where Christ put his blood into at the Last Supper. This is my blood, drink of it. And also, legend has it, Joseph of Arimathea used that same chalice to catch the blood and water out of Christ's side when they pierced it with a lance after he was dead and when he was crucified. So there's the chalice or the Grail that way. There's also the platter, which is the Eucharistic host, the plate which the sacrifice of the host and the transubstantiation of it into Christ's body is done at Catholic Mass. So there's arguments that said the silver platter here is the Grail in the same way as the chalice in the way that Parzival is written by Chrétien de Troyes. So then following that, and so 25 years after the initial Gawain text appears, and about 18 years after de Troyes, you have Wolfram von Eschenbach in 1200 writes Parzival, so Parzival but just Germanized, in German. He copies a lot from Chrétien de Troyes, but actually adds a couple interesting elements of the original Gawain back in. So Gawain is kind of like subject zero, and like you have a mutation of it somewhat into the Parzival, and you have the next Parzival that kind of mutates some of the Parzival and then brings back in some of the initial Gawain. And then you have the Grail trilogy, which is in 1190. It's Joseph de Arimathea, Merlin, Parzival, and that's from France, and it's a prose adaptation, Robert de Boron. And so that's everything up here, is written in poetry. Gawain, the Parzival, and the Parzival are all some form of verse literature, poetry or spoken lyric. And prose comes on the scene in 1190 with the Grail trilogy. Now, the interesting thing about the titles, so the three Grail trilogies from de Boron are Joseph de Arimathea, which is Joseph of Arimathea, Merlin, and Parzival. So Parzival, again, is the lead Grail hero in these 1880 and later different versions of the quest. Now, Joseph de Arimathea is, just to go back for 1 second, heretically or, Kabbalically or whatever, he is Jesus' uncle. His house is where the Last Supper was held. It was his chalice that Christ used to bless the wine and perform the transubstantiation and perform the sacrifice that day. It was his chalice that he brought to Christ's side to catch the blood after the centurion pierced him with this lance when he was being crucified. It's Joseph Arimathea's tomb Joseph of Arimathea, after Christ has been confirmed dead on the cross, goes to Pontius Pilate and says, hey, can I take the body down? Can we bury him in my tomb? So the tomb where Christ is buried in the New Testament, that has the boulder road there and centurions guarding it or whatever, right? That's Joseph of Arimathea's tomb. And there's a funny joke about that. I'll tell real quick. Bit of a dad joke, but it's okay. So Joseph of Arimathea comes in one Saturday morning from being out in the town, jumps into his home, and his wife's like, Joseph, I hear that you gave our tomb out. You sold our tomb. We were going to be buried in that tomb. Why did you give our tomb away, Joseph? He's like, oh, don't worry. The guy I gave it to said he's just going to be renting it for the weekend. So the idea that Christ is not going to be in the tomb forever, he's going to resurrect and yada, yada. So that's kind of a bit of a mishmash about Joseph of Arimathea. All right. So now we have our Grail heroes kind of laid out. Oh, one thing too is y'all might be wondering, well, what the hell? Where's Lancelot? Where's Bedivere? Where are these guys? The answer is that Lancelot and Bedivere and Tristan to some extent are the creation of the explosion in fanfic, French and German and Swedish and Italian and Scottish actually, Grail romances that burgeon off after about 1260 to 1300 AD. And Lancelot's big deal is courtly intrigue, Game of Thrones shit, jousting tournaments, hunting dragons, cheating on, well, like sleeping with King Arthur's wife, then having to fight King Arthur and yada, and wounding King Arthur. It's about like wars between different invading armies. It's about chastity and not giving in to your urges. It becomes almost entirely captured by the time Lancelot or Bedivere come along to be a very much like monarchical Christian Catholic tradition. So you get a bunch more defend the lady, chivalry, kill the pagans, kill the Muslims kind of stuff in these later versions that Lancelot comes in. It's more Mortal Kombat, martial arms, jousting tournaments, courtly love, not so much fertility Grail rituals, not so much questing out in the wilderness to fix your land that's about to die from drought. All right. So Gawain's Grail quest. This is all. Oh, also, if anybody wants to follow along, I'm sorry. All the slides except for the images one, because I can only upload 10 photos, are all available on the posts page on the channel. So if you want to download yourself a copy of the show notes, you're welcome to follow along, because this is a bit hard to read for y'all, I bet. All right. So Gawain, and this is the initial Gawain text we have that we don't have the original of, but we have people's comments on and see how it's transformed into the second version of the Gawain text in the Welsh. All right. So Gawain is the nephew of King Arthur. The story just opens kind of, in media res as the story's already going on. The story begins with Gawain on a journey, but he doesn't know what exactly he's doing. He's on a quest, but he doesn't know what he's questing for. Now, the reason he's out here is because apparently a knight who was a friend of King Arthur's was mysteriously slain when he was out hunting with Gawain. And Gawain knows in his head that he has something to do, some quest, some mission to fulfill that has to do with this buddy of his death, but he doesn't exactly know why, and he doesn't exactly know where he's going. So this is a very interesting and different kind of setting for the Grail hero or the questing knight or the fertility supplicant, the fertility ritual performer, is the sense of unknowing, this liminal space. It's not like, okay, Dragon Smog is over in that castle. We're going to get some dwarves. We're going to get some elves. We're going to get some tree men, and we're going to go fight him. No. The quest is a large part about discovering what's actually important, discovering your orientation, discovering how to make what's wrong in the world right, to bring new life into situations where death has dominated, right? So he has this feeling in his bosom that it's important, it's pressing. He has to figure out what he's supposed to do about this knight that was killed by him. So he's out here kind of wandering aimlessly in the frickin' forest and wilderness. All right. He finally comes to an empty but well-lit castle. He walks in and looks around. It's kind of like half castle, half church. Nothing's going on except that all the candles are lit in the place, so somebody should be here, but he doesn't hear or see anybody. He sits down, and all of a sudden, half the candlelight drops. And all of a sudden, from across the room on one side, this handsome, young squire, dressed impeccably, holding a white lance, like a jousting lance, a perfectly white lance, with a silver tip from which drops of blood are pouring off of, silently walks by Gawain. Gawain's like, wow, okay. The squire disappears. Then two beautiful maidens clad in two beautiful maidens holding 10 branch candelabras, like the candlestick thing that has 10 of them on it, the big old ones. They're each holding 10 branch candelabras with huge flames on them. They walk by, and Gawain notes they are burning brighter than anything he's ever seen. They exit, and now a beautiful maiden clad in pure white strides by holding a silver platter. As she passes him, the light off her dress and the platter grow brighter and brighter till it drowns out even all the candles in the castle, and it overcomes Gawain. He faints or falls unconscious or whatever. So now he's in this freaking castle. This lady with this platter, which is associated with the chalice, the Grail, this holy artifact. After this lance guy walked by and these candle girls walk by, he gets like passed out from the freaking brightness of the Grail or the dish. He wakes up, and guess who's in front of him? The freaking king of the castle, who was nowhere to be seen before, is now standing in front of him, and everybody else that was in the procession is gone. The king stands over him and tells him that his kingdom is in ruin, desolation, it's been wasted, it's a drought. His subjects are sick, diseased, the crops are failing, the cattle are dying, following his wounding in combat. So the king has been wounded in combat, and his brother was also killed in that combat. So Gawain's sitting there listening to this whole, like, yeah, dude, I'm sorry your land's all wasted. I'm sorry your subjects are dying. I'm sorry you don't have any crops. I'm sorry your cows are dead. What does this have to do with me? But Gawain really wants to ask about that weird procession, the lance with the blood coming out of it, the freaking shiny plate. Like, what's going on here? Where are I? Where did the people go? What the hell happened? But before Gawain left on this quest, and we learned this right then, like Gawain's like in his thought process in his head. He's like, that dude, like Master Miyagi of the Knights, the dude who taught me like how to wax on, wax off, be a proper knight. He always told me that knights who are actually noble should not engage in small talk and not ask too many questions and be seen rather than heard kind of stuff. And so Gawain's like, man, I really want to ask the king about that freaking lance that was bleeding and about the platter and the girl in the white dress that like knocked me unconscious. Like, I really like that. He's like, I better not ask about that. That might come off as pretentious or somehow less humble, right? And so he doesn't ask about the lance or the Grail or the platter. And then he's like, okay, well, I'll go try to figure out what's cursing your land, Mr. King. I'll be right back. And he goes out in the forest and he tries to, again, wandering around aimlessly, not even knowing what he's looking for. So now there's a curse that's on the land that he's trying to find a way to break, to make the waters flow, make the land carry crops again, the animals stop dying, the people stop dying, and somehow heal the king's wound and avenge his brother. But Gawain just goes out and wanders for 3 more days. Can't find anything, has no idea where he's going or what he's doing, so he returns to the castle. When he comes back to the castle, after a few days, he first and foremost is like, hey, king, I can't get out of my head. Like the lance that was bleeding. What the hell is with that? And as soon as he asked that question, the land becomes green again. Like the curse has been lifted. And here is the exact wording that's used in the text. And it's very specific wording. For so soon as Sir Gawain asked the lance, the waters flowed again into their channel, and all the woods were turned to verdure. Verdure, which is like greenness, like verdant. However, Gawain was only partially successful, so he partially fails this quest because he doesn't ask about the Grail or the platter that came through. So he asks about the lance, he doesn't ask about the Grail. And the king laments again that though he was partially healed, the land was partially healed, the king's wound would not be healed, and the brother would not be resurrected, and the brother would not be given a proper burial. And so, at that point, the king who's standing in front of Gawain disappears and is never seen or heard from again. Makes one wonder, was he already dead? Was he a ghost? Like what? But the point is that in this version, the very first version of the Grail quest to come to the Welsh Isles, to come to Britain, The quester is only partially successful because he doesn't ask about the nature of the Grail, the nature of the procession, these symbols, these very important mythic freaking ritual symbols that are walking in front of you that are going to be very important if you want to actually resurrect the drowned god, the hanged god. You actually want to heal the king, revivify the land, stop the crops from dying. You need access to these powerful symbols, these mythic symbols that are of fertility. And Gawain's out there wandering around like an idiot because he doesn't even know what his quest is. He doesn't know where he's going or who killed who. He finds the castle. He sees these very important things that are like signs that like, well, maybe this is important to the quest you're on, but you don't know what you're doing. And he, in his knightly pride or knightly lockjaw or whatever, says to himself, oh, I'm not going to ask about those. I don't engage in small talk. And then he goes again for 3 more days, wandering around like an idiot, can't find the cause of the curse on the land, the source of the curse on the land, can't find what's affecting the king. So after 3 days of like running around like a chicken with his head cut off, comes back to the king, asks about the lance, and boom, the land is partly healed. However, without asking about the chalice or the platter, the Grail, the king can't be healed. The king either dead and remaining dead, or clinging to life, dies and vanishes right there. So partially complete quest, but the essential takeaway is to gain access to the fertility ritual, to gain access to a productive quest that can heal the land, a productive quest that can save and revive society. You have to have an open mind and be willing to look for and ask about symbols that might be in plain sight that have a deeper ritualistic meaning that goes back more than you know. So you see the glance that bleeds, you ask about it, and it will, or if you ask questions at the right time, it will orient your journey and your quest along the right line. But to not ask either because of disinterest or because of laziness or because you think you're a know-it-all and not know the nature of these specific sacred ritual items will ensure that you either waste time running around or you fail the quest and don't heal the ruler the way that could have been done if you'd not been introverted. All right. So here's a rendering right here of this is of that glowing white maiden. This is a different translation, but it's fine. It may be, I think, home through a castle hall by a beautiful damsel or an any float through the air in Arthur's palace veiled in white samite. So that's a different version, but that's a artistic depiction of the lady in white with the little halo over her head and carrying the platter, walking through the already well-lit king's castle. All right. So now let's go to Parsifal. Now, one thing that's important to note, because Parsifal is kind of like, I don't know, like what's one of those songs, or not songs, one of those shows that like spun off into, didn't like Friends have like 6 spin-offs or some shit? So like think about like Friends kind of, right? Like you have like Friends and like everybody hates Friends, but everybody watches Friends, so whatever. And then like Joey goes off and is a spin-off, and then like, I don't know, Chandler or Drunk Ross, all of their own spin-offs. But like a lot of them don't catch on. Like I think like maybe let's just hypothetically in this world of imagining say that for some reason Drunk Ross was a spin-off from Friends and nobody liked the other ones. No one liked the other spin-offs, but people actually liked Drunk Ross' Friends spin-off. And so Drunk Ross, boom, flooding the airwaves. The other one's kind of blah. So Parsifal is the Drunk Ross of the Grail quest. After the Gawain quest narrative gets published or transferred to France, and Chichen de Troyes writes Parsifal, or no, the Cabot de Grail, French is hard. People read that, and so Parsifal, who's the hero of that one, takes off as a titular hero of most of the following versions. So they're the bulk of the existing Grail texts that survived. However, they differ a lot one from the other, but they're like in the task to be achieved and the effects resulting from the hero's success or failure. So Parsifal is very distinct from Gawain in the insistence upon the sickness and disability of the ruler of the land, the Fisher King. The Fisher King's infirmity, the wound to the king, his sickness, his advanced old age, something wrong with the king, is regarded in these texts as the direct cause of the wasting of the land. and it gradually assumes overwhelming importance. In the end of these Parsifal quests that actually have the Grail involved, the quester's only task is the healing of the king. And once the healing of the king is performed, the land will be healed. So there's this intimate linking between the health of the king, the body of the king, the virility of the king, the wholeness, non-woundedness of the king, and the health of the land. So if the king gets wounded or is deathly ill, the crops are going to reflect that and start dying. The animals are going to reflect that. Thanks, Ryan. The crops are going to reflect that and start dying. The babies are going to die in childbirth. Old folks are going to die more often. If the king's health is not pristine, if he's wounded, if he's not at his best, the land will mirror his state. And so this notion that comes from the Parzival is, you have a land out there it's drought. It's been dry for 10 years. Everything's dying. There's like 3 cows and like 2 40-year-olds left, and that's it. But we're not going to, we're going to work on the king. We're going to fix what's wrong with the king. If we go on a quest to fix what's wrong with the king, then poof, magically, the land will reflect the king's improved health. Likewise, if the quester were to fail and the king were to die, I'm not sure what happens to the land, but it probably is also going to die as well. All right. And this is what also links the Percival and the Gawain form. Gawain is the first form, the first one written, and Percival follows that. And the reason we know this is because Percival takes the Gawain form, which failed half of the quest, failed the task, and Percival does the same 2 tasks, healing the land, healing the king, but front loads the king. So if you heal the king, the land is healed. So where Gawain failed on half the quest, Percival succeeds. So Parzival's kind of the fulfillment of the Gawain form, where the king, the ruler of the land, the Fisher King, we'll go into why he's called that in a minute here, why the Fisher King, being healthy, will end the wasting of the land, will end the drought and plague and famine. All right. So this version of the Parzival story is in Chetin du Troyes' Parzival. The second one, the first one we have that's preserved, but the second known text, and that was in France. Okay. So here's another guy who comes in a little bit later, Ducron. He is a different myth or different quest a little bit. So he, again, is kind of a parody on the Gawain myth, is that, so he, instead of going out in the wilderness, when we're like, okay, I'm on a quest, what am I doing? Where am I going? And then coming upon a chapel randomly, and then after meeting with the king, running around trying to figure out what's the king's curse? How do we fix the king's curse? And just wasting 3 more days before going back. Ducron knows what he's doing when he steps out the door. So instead of Gawain running around wondering, what are you not questing for? Ducron knows that he has to go out. He has to go find the cure for the Fisher King, find the Grail, deal with the Grail Knight, and save the land. So basically, he's a Gawain who already has all the questions answered for him. So obviously so he knows what questions to ask. He knows when you see the lance, ask about the lance. When you see the platter or the Grail, ask about the Grail. When an old woman pops up in front of you, don't call her, tell her she's ugly and to get the hell out of your way. Maybe offer her a drink or something to eat, and then maybe she might be like, a nymph or a goddess, and you won't be smoten and end up growing a tail, right? So the Gawain, the Parzival, and the Ducron narratives in the myth are almost identical with one little bitty difference, right, in each one. In Gawain, he has no idea what the hell is going on. He fails part of the quest because he doesn't ask the questions because he doesn't know what the hell is going on. Okay? Parzival, not as ignorant as Gawain, but doesn't really know the secrets or what's going on or what he's questing for. But because in Parzival, all you have to do is ask about what ails the king instead of the lance or the cup. And once you heal they'll heal the king. And once you heal the king, you automatically heal the land, right? So Parzival, same thing, different winning conditions for completing the quest. All right. Now Ducron is separate from that. In Ducron, he has all the knowledge that Gawain lacked. He knows what questions to ask. He knows he needs to ask them. He knows what he's questing for. He knows what affects the king. He knows he has to go try to heal the king. All right. And in all the Ducron narratives, there are no failures because he knows as soon as he goes to the Grail, to the castle, and he sees the Grail, he's like, oh, what's that Grail about? Boom. King's partly healed. Oh, what's that lance about? Boom. Spell is broken. And keeps the Grail. So it's called the Grail King in Duke Corona instead of the Fisher King. But same difference. We'll go into that symbol again in a minute here. But he knows what question to ask. He goes and asks him. Spell is broken. Land's healed. Poof, right? So we also learn the action restored the land of fruitfulness. Yet had the land been waste, but by his coming had folk and land alike been delivered. Thus, the earliest preserved text from the quest is again the Gawain form, identified by the land healing coming as the result of the quest, right? So again, in the Gawain, which is the initial form, we have the ignorance of the quester, him not knowing. We have the exposure to the symbols, the cup, the candelabra, the platter, the lance that bleeds. And then you have in Gawain, the failure to inquire about the nature of these symbols leads to partial failure and partial success. But again, the quest for the king, the wasting of the land, the wounding of the king, the breaking of the curse, the healing of the land, the healing of the king are seen in Gawain. They come in different forms in Parsifal, and they come in different forms in De Crone. Now, I guess the question one could ask is like, well, how do you know that Gawain didn't borrow from De Crone? Or how do you know that Parsifal is not the original? Like, how are you saying that these both borrow from Gawain? That doesn't make sense. The reason is because Gawain has the full Monty, the whole thing. Gawain has the knowledge issue, the issue of knowledge of the quester. It has the issue of the king, the wasteland. It has all the elements, right? Parsifal does not have all those elements. In Parsifal, the quest is succeeded, and you don't have to ask about the lance and the Grail. You just have to fix the king. So it has everything Gawain has, but it doesn't have everything Gawain has. It's a little bit less. Gawain has the full Monty. Parsifal has a little bit less and doesn't do this part. Then De Crone comes in and has some of Parsifal, but has some stuff from Gawain in there too. And the stuff from Gawain in there is stuff that Parsifal didn't have in it. So the stuff that De Crone borrowed from, that put in his narrative rather, he couldn't have borrowed it from Parsifal and de Troyes because it wasn't in Parsifal and de Troyes. It was only in the Gawain version. And the same thing, we know Parsifal didn't come, de Troyes' Parsifal didn't come from De Crone because there are elements in Parsifal that don't appear in De Crone. So if it's not a chapter about the Fisher King, let's say, in De Crone, how can de Troyes steal something from Parsifal that's not in the book he was reading as a source? However, these things do appear in Gawain. So because of kind of this overlap of what's borrowing what from whom and what's not traded, we can see that whenever these were written or passed down, the initial text that both rely on is Gawain. Now, whether or not Gawain is the first text written about it, or whether or not that guy was copying or riffing on somebody from... Oh, sorry. Hey, thanks, Corey. Take good care. All right, so the point there then, right, is that so we can say that maybe this is something before the Gawain text, but at least we know that these two texts came after De Crone and de Troyes came after the Gawain text. All right, so here are the elements. Here's the key to everything. Here's the elements of the fertility myth in the Grail quest. This is something that is universal to the fertility ritual, cult, Grail myth stuff that's in the Gawain and becomes transferred to the Parsifal and the De Crone. All right, is the healing of the Fisher King. It can be the Fisher King, the Grail King, the King of the Land, the ruler of that first magical enchanted castle that the quester goes through and finds the procession of symbols, the lance, the platter, the Grail, the candelabras, the maiden, the squire. He is the ruler of that castle. He's not King Arthur. King Arthur's over here, and it's not part of the quest. It's the ruler of the castle to which the quester comes. All right? Breaking the wasteland curse. In all the fertility ritual cults versions of this is all the way up through like 1250 to 1300 AD, the land is affected by a curse that's related to the wounding or the age or the invirality of the Fisher King. And when the curse on the land is broken or the king is healed, the waters will be freed, which is the next one. The wasteland can be rejuvenated by freeing the waters, which is equivalent to healing the Fisher King and revivifying the land, the crops, the cattle, the everything. Now, there are specific fertility cult symbols that are integral to these Grail myths that are original. And they are the lance, the cup, the sword, the stone, the dish, and the pentacle. Now, they are doing double duty at some points. For example, the dish and the pentacle are oftentimes interchanged for each other, and the stone and the sword are oftentimes interchanged for each other. So if you see stone, think maybe stone or sword. If you think dish, think maybe dish or pentacle. So for example, Gawain has a pentacle and sees the dish, but they are symbolically the same connotation. The other thing is the Chapel Perilous. This doesn't exist in all of them, but the Gawain myth it does, which is as part of your quest when you're going to go find how to break that curse that's affecting the land. You have to go to this hostile chapel, usually a dark chapel, no candles on, middle of the forest, middle of the night. You walk in, on the altar, there's a dead knight or a dead maiden, and a candle pops on right above the knight's head. And the quest was like, oh, that's a little weird. And then apparently this black hand, it's described in all the text, comes out of the stained glass window behind the altar and attacks Gawain or Parsifal or whoever the questing knight is there. I'm not sure how big the black hand is supposed to be. Nobody goes into that. But like if it's like Cousin It, like walking around in, I don't know why that's so scary, but it'd be a little freaky anyways. And in some of the myths, the black hand has been what's been killing all these damn knights, including the one that's lying there on the altar in the Chapel Perilous. So the Chapel Perilous is where if there is an entity or a monster or a ghost or a black hand or a Grail guardian to fight and slay to break the curse, you do it in the Chapel Perilous. Now, there are versions where you have to both ask the question about what the hell is going on in the Chapel Perilous and then go there and fight the dude in order to break the curse. That's Parsifal. But the Chapel Perilous, it was the kind of the pinnacle of the quest. It's where it's the boss level. It's where the bad guy lives. You're going in. You're trying to take him out to break the curse. All right, the Medicine Man. Now, the Medicine Man is very important for a lot of these fertility cult rituals, but doesn't really directly appear in the Grail quest, except for, Gawain is in a lot of ways the shaman or the medicine man of the Grail quest. Parsifal to less degree, and this is why we think Gawain's first again, is because Gawain has special knowledges of herbs and special knowledges of healing powers and which herbs to apply in order to fix wounds, in order to cure disease, in order to even sometimes get rid of curse through natural, organic, herbalistic methods. And so Gawain, as both quester and healer, is a little bit different than the role of the shaman or the medicine man in the fertility ritual, properly speaking, in the Near East and in like the Middle East and the Far East. And so hypothesis is that Gawain has kind of been combined into quester and medicine man because the king, the Fisher King, is the one who actually Gawain always finds either wounded or not able to perform in the bed or old beyond his years or under a curse or feeble, right? So Gawain has to, whether it's by asking a question or going out and finding a fern that has healing powers or going to the Chapel Perilous and killing the Black Hand or a ghost or a monster, Gawain can also heal the king in some versions by just applying frontier medicine to the king. So the medicine man is both the person who accesses the magical realms, the shamanistic realms, the mythical fertility symbols. The shaman's the one who gets to see the procession of the symbols, lance, cup, sword, stone, dish, pentacle, at the holy castle to try to make sense of these divine symbols, to try to make sense of how these things can break curses and bring the land back into fertility. And so even though there's no actual shaman or medicine man in the Gawain text or the early Grail text, right? Gawain kind of serves this dual purpose as both medicine man and questing hero and is represented by his healing abilities. No one other than Gawain or Percival in any of the Grail texts, Grail myths that are of this time heals anyone. The only person, whether it's a man, woman, child, goddess, whatever, who ever heals anyone in any of the Grail narratives of this epoch is the quester. There's no doctor on staff. There's no sexy nurses. It's just the quester is the only one who heals there. The swords dance is another fertility symbol in there. The swords dance is basically the ritual itself. It's when you're going to do the ceremony of hanging the hanged god, drowning the drowned god, cutting up the corn god, burying him in the field, the mock sacrifice or the actual sacrifice to revivify the land, to break winter's spell and have spring come around and bring crops and prosperity to your land. The sword dance refers to this kind of ritualistic, shamanistic movement of the body, enacting, chanting, dancing, etc. We see that today, like May Day, maypoles, the May dance, the Feast of Fools dance, these Saturnalia, the Bacchanalia, these different rituals that have a lot of dancing, like dervish kind of flailing about, like esoteric cults, Etruscan cults, those kind of mystery things that are a lot more Dionysian than they are formed up. And finally, the sacred egg, which is, if you think about it, it's the moon, it's the womb of a mother, it's the halo above Jesus' head, Mary's head. It's oh, hey, Corey, welcome back. Hey, Danny. Hey, Danny. And so the sacred egg is the womb of the mother. It's the earth. It's the moon. It's a lot of things. It's the platter. It's the platter. It's the chalice. It's the receptacle vesicle. It's all of that. Oh, hopefully the oven wasn't on. Did they succeed in climbing the oven, or they just couldn't get the door down? All right. So now, bearing these symbols in mind, let's look at this real quick here. Boom. What do we have here? That's awesome. All right. So we have here the Ace of Cups. This is a tarot deck. Obviously, if you didn't know, it's a tarot deck. It's one of the oldest versions of the tarot deck we have. Comes from these kind of occult, ceremonial, mythical. Good. Glad they did not succeed. All right. So you see just in this image here, right? You have the chalice, the grail, the cup. You have streams of water for the freeing of the waters flowing out of it. You have the dove, which is divine intervention. It's from heaven, both in the Christian mythos and in pagan mythos. You have the wafer. You have the Eucharist. You have the bread. You have the cosmic egg right here as well. You can't see my cursor, but I'm pointing at the cross that's in the dove's beak. And that's cups. Again, one of the tarot suits. The 4 suits of tarot are linked to the 4 symbols that are prevalent in the fertility myth and the Grail myth. But we can kind of get a good visualization of it here too. Swords. Again, swords a lot of times relate to like sacrificing, dying, resurrecting gods. Rods or wands. Again, the fertility ritual, the planting of the maypole, the male phallic symbol, the male fertility symbol there. And then finally, pentangles or platters or coins. Now, this is very interesting. If you can pay attention here, there is, so the pentangle, not the pentagram, the pentangle that's different. It was actually Sir Gawain's like emblem on his shield was the pentacle. And it means for Gawain in his quest, the 5 virtues of knighthood were represented by each point. Honor, chivalry, compassion, courage, strength, some version of those virtues are the 5 points. And the interconnectedness of the symbol and the fact that they all touch and never stop, you can go around that symbol infinitely, represents the connectedness of these virtues to the wholeness of being a proper knight, a proper courtly chivalric gentleman,
back in the day. It also represents the Mary, Christ's mother's sign later on. The pentacle becomes adopted as her sigil or her symbol. The thing I want to look at here, though, is the architecture depicted on this tarot card and the proportions of stuff. So at the same time, let me take one step back real quick. At the same time that all these Grail stories were being written for the first and were being published and disseminated, and Francis getting them from like I said, like 1180 AD up until 1250, the 70-year period where everybody's writing Grail romances, everything's going out there. This is the same exact period in time when all the construction on the great Gothic cathedrals all across Europe begins. There are leaps and bounds forward in technology, in masonry, in projects, in planning, in communication, and in the society that happens during the same brief 80-year period in time. Then something happens after that. We don't exactly know what, but many of the great Gothic cathedrals were never even finished because something happened. Again, when around 1300-ish, boom, no more Grail romances being written, no more dissemination of the fertility ritual, no more quest narratives, no more of this stuff, and no more Gothic cathedrals. Not only that, but the ones that are being built are abandoned. Something we don't exactly know what, but all across Europe the same thing happens. But I want to draw the attention to is this structure right here, this arch. See the three pentacles? The arch that goes over that is an innovation of the times, the vaulted ceiling that allowed the Gothic cathedrals to be built in the way they were. And unlike when you just stack stuff on top of it, so if I'm like, I don't know, stacking blocks or books, right? The thing that keeps the books to the blocks together, even though they're not perfectly aligned and gravity's pulling on them, is the force down, the pressure down. And so if you're doing like something like Stonehenge or a stack of blocks or like building even bricks upon bricks, right? Like this, the downward pressure is what's keeping the thing stable in the face of gravity. Now this vaulted arch here, you see, does something entirely new and different. The way it spaces the stones out, it uses a certain geometry that uses both vertical pressure and horizontal pressure. So this vaulted arch is the strongest geometrical shape you can use for spatially working with stone buildings. Now, remember I mentioned the sacred egg is one of the mythic symbols before, or the cosmic egg, the sacred egg. Have a look at that. So this was actually found. This seal right here covers the entrance to the well underneath Glastonbury Cathedral in England, which is supposed to be maybe the resting place for the Grail. So if you see these two circles that overlap, right, it's called the cosmic egg, kind of looks like an infinity sign. The reason why you look at it is you see that bit in the middle that actually looks just like an egg, has a little triangle part up and triangle part down. It's that space in the Venn diagram where the two circles overlap. When the circumference of one circle is touching the midpoint in the diameter of the other, you have this overlapping segment. Well, I want you to look, if you can, put it in your head. If you're driving, don't look. This top part of that middle section, the top part of the top half of that egg. And I want you to look at the arch right here, the arch construction right where that 8 is. And also the same arch construction that contains those 3 pentacles there. It's the same shape. And it's derivative of what's called sacred geometry. We won't get into all that right now. But basically, they figured out at the same time they were writing these Grail mythical quests that these old geometric Pythagorean styles of learning, when you have these circles that overlap in this way, you have this egg shape here that gives you all kinds of dimensions that you can then apply to the rest of the world. And the structures in there, both that vaulted shape as well as the proportion of the pinnacle of the vaulted shape to the base of that shape, right, will give you gives the most structurally sound for stoneworking and masonry position in the world. That's why all the vaulted arches they discovered this time hold up well to this day, and we don't really even know how to do that shit anymore. But it all comes from this sacred symbol. And it's funny because this symbol is covering the well in the basement of Glastonbury Cathedral, which is supposed resting place of the Grail too. All right. Let's do the Fisher King now, eh? All right. So just to go over again, the Fisher King is nominally referred to. He's the guy who's wounded. He's the guy to whom the questing knight goes. Gawain goes to the castle. It's empty, but as well that Fisher King's the guy that comes out. All right, so back again. The health of the land directly mirrors that of the king, forms the basic ritualistic idea of the Grail tradition. The position of a people whose prosperity and the fertility of the land are closely bound up with the life and virility of the king, who is not a mere man, but a divine reincarnation, as in, like the Egyptian pharaohs, as in the Babylonian kings, as in the Mesopotamian kings, as in the Assyrian kings, where the king is like half divine, half human, right? So it would make sense that if your king is a god and the god somehow gets into bad health or smited or something, then... Sorry, 1 second, folks. All right, we're back. All right. So if the king falls into languishment, if the king becomes ill or infertile or wounded, right, the land also becomes wasted because this linking between the ruler of the land and the land itself in a physical sense. So our boy Sir James Fraser again describes this actually a very interesting version of this in practice in the Nyaking ritual. It's from an African tribe around where Congo is nowadays, but this is back in like the 1800s. So the king of this tribe, though regarded with reverence, must not be allowed to become old or feeble, lest, with the diminishing vigor of the ruler, the cattle will sicken, they won't increase their numbers, the crop should rot in the field, and men will die in ever-growing numbers. So the idea that if the king is allowed to become old or feeble or wounded or not virile, the land will begin to waste, cattle die, crops fail, people dying in the street, cats and dogs living together. This culture has such a belief in that when the chief becomes feeble or wounded or whatever, the other not the king, but the chiefs, condemn the king to death forthwith, communicating the sentence to him by spreading a white cloth over his face and knees during his midday slumbers. The king takes a nap every day in the midday. If the count elders get together, like, this guy's wounded or sick or not virile or feeble, they'll go throw a white sheet over him, and that means that you've been voted off the island. You've been sentenced to death. Back in the day, in the same culture, the king was starved to death in a hut in company of a young maiden. But in consequence, it said the great virality and protracted suffering of one king is no longer done. So basically, it says now he is now strangled in a hut, especially erected for that purpose. So basically, back in the day, they throw the white cloth over the king because if he's sick, the land's going to be sick and we're not having good crops. So the king's got to go. He's feeble, he's sick, he's wounded. So they throw a white cloth over him. The king's like, well, that's my number. They erect a hut in the middle of town specifically for this, put him in there with a young maiden, lock him in, and let them starve to death in the hut, and then they get rid of the hut. Apparently, that was an older practice, and nowadays, they build a hut, they put the king in, unsure if there's a maiden or not involved in this. They go in and strangle the king, and then tear the hut down. At one time in the past, Fraser argues he might have been attacked by a rival or slain, but this has long been superseded by the ceremonial slaying of the monarch, who after his death is revered. So even though they're like, dude, you're screwing up our land, you are sick, you're feeble, you're wounded, you're not able to procreate, we're going to throw this white cloth on you and then either strangle you, starve you, or some combination of those two, and get a new king on here. Well, even though they were doing that to the king, as soon as they actually starved him, strangled him, slew him, killed him, whatever, he would be revered. He would be glorified. The king who they just killed for not being able to make the land fertile, and they sacrifice him, he would like go up to their Valhalla or their, heaven or whatever. So this linking of the king's health and body to that of the land is almost universal in pre-Christian society and definitely influences and is this notion of this fertility myth back to Indra and the Vedic rituals and the Mahabharata, to Attis, Adonis, Osiris in the Near East, to Adonis in the Phoenicians, Adonis in the Greeks, to the Fisher King, the fertility cults, the ritual in Britain in 1100 when these start being written. All right. Oh, this is hard to... So this is what I was talking about earlier. So Christianity is eventually overtakes the fertility ritual. So by 1300 AD, we're still having Grail romances or things that deal with King Arthur's court. But they're not Grail myths. They're not Grail quests. They're Grail romances, courtly romances. So again, symbols, then the mythical symbolic ritual elements, the lance, the Grail, the platter, the lance, the procession, the wounding, the wasteland, the black hand, the Fisher King, the chapel perilous, all disappear from the Grail romance cycles that are being written after 1300. So we have from 1180 when Gawain supposedly written to 1300, the same time the Gothic cathedrals were being built. We have all these fertility Grail quests. After 1300, they replace the quest and the wasteland and the curse with Christian virtue ethics kind of quests. Courtly love, how to be chivalrous to a lady but super chaste, and how to honor the commands of your lord and protect your subjects. Chastity, no sex out of marriage. Even if the king's wife is hitting on you, you have to no, and don't look at her, or don't even take her handkerchief, dude. And honor, duty, as the vassal to the lord, as the parishioner to the priest, to the bishop, to the pope. These very dogmatic orthodox structures that typify Christian myth, that typify biblical allegory, biblical story, get planted in the Grail characters, Parsifal, Gawain, Arthur, Lancelot, Tristan, whoever, get planted in their narratives after 1300. And it makes sense because by 1300, Christianity, Catholicism specifically, but Christianity in general, had spread from the Middle East, through Greece, up in the continent, and far out into Scandinavia and into the British Isles, Scotland, England by 1300. So Christianity was a new upcoming thing. They didn't like heretics very much, tend to excommunicate them or burn them at the stake or fight wars with them. So one can understand why they would dominate the narrative. Now, just to close here, I mean, there's more we can talk about maybe at a future time. I know I've already gone over an hour or so, but the point that the Christian narrative taking over the Grail myth and the Grail romances, the Grail texts, is that all of these mystical, magical things that were going on with the ritual, the swords dance, the actual ritual performed, the burying of the vegetation god, the life god, the drowning of the drowned god to bring fish to the sea. The idea that you have to, as a human being who lives on the world and is in relation to the natural world around you, that there are forces and powers there that you don't understand that do exist. The cycles of nature, the movement of the stars in heaven, the tides, the oceans, the moon, the weather, all these things, whether or not crops will grow this year, whether or not an enemy tribe invades and kills you all, whether or not your king orders you to battle on this given day, right? All these things are seen in the Grail quest and in the fertility ritual as involving the actions of the people in order to keep the system going and well, right? The leader has to be a good leader, and if he's not a good leader, you'll see that reflected in the decimation, the wasting of his land. The health of the land reflects the health of its leader. And the fertility rituals took this very literally to meaning that if the king's wounded, if the king's old, if the king's feeble, it's not like, oh, we're going to have a worse tax rate and we're going to get invaded by an enemy nation and maybe they'll annex some of our land, or he's going to have the grain sent to the wrong people, so I'm going to go hungry. No. It's not talking like mismanagement, bureaucratic, bad leadership. We're talking like If the king loses an arm, then 1/10 of the country is going to explode, fall into an island, get taken by a volcano, get invaded, or like freeze. Like if the king were to get mortally, so if the king gets wounded in his groin, this is the case with one of the Gowan myths, he gets wounded in the groin, and because the king's groin, his parts are wounded, all procreation in the land is stopped. No more animals, no more livestock are giving birth. All human babies that are born stillborn is an entire land. So as the king's body is physically wounded or hurt, a mirror of that affliction goes over the whole land. So the crops aren't reproducing or seeding. All the cattle and all the livestock aren't having babies. All the human babies that are being born dead as a result of the king's wounding. So this isn't something that you can go see the oracle at Delphi about, or that you can hope the marginal tax rate changes next year and you get more income tax return to save the kingdom. Like, all life in the kingdom has stopped because the king has lost the ability to bring life to the people. So you better get on it right now. You better go figure out how to heal that king, however you do it, because the king and the land are actually connected, right? In, obviously, the Christian taking over the Grail myths and the stories, everything's more moralized. You have Christianity, you have the idea of grace, of theodicity, the notion that, well, God allows bad stuff to happen in the world because he's still an all-powerful, all-just, all-merciful, all-good God, but he also allows bad things to happen, and you have free will. It kind of delinks this direct relationship between the leader and the land, the leader and the people in the land. That was going on in this fertility ritual kind of space, because instead of having a leader who is directly correlated in accountability to the health of the land, his well-being is the land's productivity and fertility. If you have an idea where there's a God who's not the king and who works on structures of grace, and that we're not worthy of salvation, but through grace and through understanding our fallen nature, we can appeal to this God to get salvation, right? But we don't quite understand it. We can't know it. It's a mystery, but it's a mystery that we can never even strive to know, and never will we work for. We never really quite know. So since God is king and Pope's his head on earth at this point in time in the Catholic taking over of Europe, Pope's his head in Rome. Maybe there's one in Constantinople. We'll see. King is not divine, but just a ruler on the earth, right? Anything that really happens to the land at that point, if the king is just a dude and God's up in heaven and the Pope's in Rome and the crops go bad and the animals aren't giving birth, and there's a lot more stillborn babies than we'd like to see, it's not obvious anymore to the ritualistic mind or to the cultural mind what a person can do about that then. Because it's not something that's wrong with the king that's causing the wasting of the land. The king's fine. The king's in perfect health. The king's walking around. The king's a drunkard. The king's a sober guy. The king's a great warrior. The king's a crappy warrior. But he's in good health, and the land can still be bad. Why? Well, maybe it's sin. Maybe you are not being as honorable as you should be, little peasant, or maybe the king's not being as honorable. It's all, well, maybe God's punishing us for our sins. But the thing is, our sins or our malactions are at the same time completely nondescript. Like, you don't know, if I do X sin, God's going to kill X amount of cattle. No, it's not exchangeable like that. You can't say, also, you can see, well, these guys over the Huns were riding through here and raping and pillaging everything. And they're doing, God hasn't smitten them. Why is God smiting? Like the imbalance of justice and stuff, right? That there's no equivalent exchange. It has to be absorbed by the Christian worldview and the idea that the power is displaced from the ruler who is semi-divine and controls the land. His body mirrors the land up to heaven, where you can pray, you can ask saints to help, you can, give tithing, you can give penance, you can do acts of mercy to your fellow men, but may or may not listen. Things might get better or worse. Your mileage may vary. And so that delinking of the physical phenomena of nature and the ability to appeal to it through some ritual, divine interaction largely disappears as Catholicism and Christianity in general takes over. I'll close on the last thing, is that even though in 1300 or so, up to 1500-ish, that Christianity and Catholicism had established an orthodoxy, obviously, we'll just say at 1300, when all these Grail narratives are put out using Christian symbolism, all the pagan stuff, the Grail, the lance, the wasteland, the king, the freeing of the waters, swords dance, black hand, procession, all that is out. Knights should be truthful, chaste, chivalrous, and obey their king and obey God is in. Those are the challenges. One knight will go out and he'll be, accosted by a bunch of very loose, very bawdy, very busty women. And he'll have to oh no, I can't even look away. Like that's the Grail quest now. Or the quest of the knight now is to turn away from temptation and honor your Lord on earth and in heaven is the takeaway now. But even though this was taking over in the written narrative in the church, right, there were still a few individuals who were practicing a variant of this fertility cult, this fertility myth, this Grail myth in Britain, Scotland, Ireland, and the British Isles, Welsh country down there, even up until 13, 14, 1500, maybe after that. And they were specifically took and transformed the Attis, Adonis, Osiris myth into what was specifically and only Mithra. So Mithra is a god, it's a fertility god, a war god to a life god, but not a buried, drowned, or hanged god. Mithra goes away for part of the year, kind of like Persephone going to Hades, and comes back. As apart from Attis, Adonis, Osiris, Indra, those other prefigured gods, Tammuz, and Jesus, if later on, or Jesus at this point, don't have to die and be resurrected to bring life to the land. Mithra can just kind of revivify the land at their leisure, but does so in cycles, so you still have seasons. And Mithraism is practiced at this point in time almost exclusively. Well, Mithra is the god of the legionaries and the centurions in pre-Christian Rome. And so now you have all these Roman legions and soldiers all over Britain during this time before Christianity, and Justinian says, oh, Rome is Christian now, convert everybody, yada, yada, yada. You have all these legionaries who are out there in the British Isles, in Rome, or in Ireland, Scotland, Britannia in general, what would now be called the UK. You have all these Roman military outposts, small bases away from towns, military installations, where they would have, and we've found in the archaeological record and anthropological record, shrines dating back to this time and before it in Roman military outposts dealing with fertility ritual specifically for the god Mithra, which was adopted before 0 AD, before Christ was born. Mithra was adopted kind of as a fertility ritual for the legions, centurions, military force of Rome. They would have shrines of Mithra wherever they walked. And so even though the Christian theology takes over, the narrative is in the literature as well as the cultural practice by 1300, and certainly after that, these little Roman outposts, these little Mithric cultural centers and fertility cults kept going on throughout this time, off the grid, off the radar, and had different versions of Grail myths they incorporated based upon where they were in England. For example, Glastonbury Castle is where one of these outposts was originally stationed, and has a large bit of Mithric fertility image, symbol, and sign images, right, associated and built right into the castle. A lot of Mithric images are incorporated into the structure of a lot of these Gothic cathedrals, as are Attic, Adonic, and other fertility myths. For example, and we'll end on this too, so this is at Chartres Cathedral in France. It has 2 phoenix dragons drinking from the Grail cup on a pillar inside of Chartres Cathedral. So again, this high Gothic era, beautiful cathedral. If you ever have a chance, just Google image Chartres if you're not driving. But you have these mythical beasts, phoenix dragons, right, drinking out of a Grail at the castle that was built about this time. So these were important symbols and images for the people who were writing these myths, passing on these rituals, these symbols, these important relationships between man and earth, and man and ruler, and man and the universe, and also building the most amazing Gothic cathedrals, the most amazing construction Europe has ever seen in its history, all during the same 80-year period of time. And incorporating the symbols from the myths and the narratives into their architecture, using geometrical figures derived from mythical symbols and mythical units and systems of measure derived from these fertility cults and rituals and myths. It's pretty interesting. Okay, folks, I hope that was enjoyable. I've got to wrap it up. The show notes are up on the page. If you go to this podcast will become your tomb homepage, and you go to posts, and you go down there. I have uploaded, I've only uploaded 10 of the slides because it will only let you upload 10 images. So I put the 10 cards that had the text on them up there. So I'll go post the rest of I'll make a new post after this that has the slides and show notes that I didn't post in the earlier drop yesterday. So we will do that. Hopefully, fingers crossed, Owen will be back on with us next Thursday. So a week from yesterday. Baby's doing good. Baby's healthy. Baby's well. They're just getting adjusted to life, still having baby around. He's a cute little guy. So hopefully, Owen will be back for some more Sleep Token next Thursday. If he's not, the Thursday after that, or I'm going to go down there and beat his ass myself. But if not, if he doesn't do next Thursday, I'll try to do a next Friday myth discussion again to kind of keep things live around here. If anybody has any myths or parts of this myth or parts of anything that they want talked about, you can drop it in the chat. You can post it on the post page. You can comment on any of the videos. This will be up as a independent video too in a second here as soon as we finish the live stream. So if you have any ideas of other myths you want me to talk about next week, let me know. If not, I'll pick something or maybe just keep going with. That's funny. Thank you, Ryan. So hopefully that was, hopefully that was informative. Hopefully it wasn't too dense or whatever. But again, I'll post the show notes up when we get. If you have any ideas of any myths you'd like me to discuss or not discuss, or where are you, Danny? Discuss or not discuss, or I just expand more on the Grail stuff. Could do that too. Whatever catches y'all's fancy, let me know. And I'll be in the chats and on the posts and the comments and posting shorts and stuff all week. Y'all have a great weekend. Take care. And it's Good Friday, so you can eat the fish because they don't have any feelings. And that whole Joseph de Arimathea, he's going to be lending Jesus' tomb tonight, but 2,200 years ago. Oh, you're in Seoul. Cool. It would be midnight, huh? Dang. Well, I'll let you get some rest. Hey, take care, everybody. Y'all have a great one. Austere, sorrowful, mournful, profound Good Friday to you all.